Welcome back to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. Today, we're doing the second part of a 3-part case based on the Moors murders. If you want to hear part 1, then please go back to episode 17. If not, then stick around for part 2. Before we get going, you can find us on all the socials at What They Hide Pod. You can email us whattheyhidepod@gmail.com if you want to suggest a show, leave a shout out. You can reach out to us in any of those places. Now we're going to be doing shout outs at the end of the show, so make sure you stick around and don't forget to like, follow, share and all that jazz so that we grow the show and get more people listening. Alright, let's crack on with the show. This episode contains discussions of violence, abuse and crimes against children. Please take care whilst listening. Listener discretion is strongly advised. The house is quiet, not silent, but close to it. The kind of quiet where small sounds become noticeable. A shift in movement, the creak of furniture, the faint hum of a television in the background. It is the evening of October the 6th, 1965. Inside the house on Wardlebrook Avenue, the air feels heavy. Still, unsettled. David Smith sits in the living room. He is waiting. There is no clear reason for the tension he feels, nothing obvious that explains it, and yet it is there, subtle, persistent. The room itself is ordinary. A sofa, a chair, a small table. Everyday objects arranged without thought, nothing out of place, nothing that suggests what is about to happen. Ian Brady moves through the room. His movements are controlled, measured. There is no visible urgency, no sign of agitation. If anything, he appears calm, composed, focused. Myra Hindley is nearby, present, watching. Her role is less active in this moment, but she is not detached. She is aware, observing. There is a sense of anticipation, something unspoken, something that has already been decided. A knock at the door. The sound cuts through the stillness. Brady moves towards it. Unhurried, he opens the door. Standing outside is 17-year-old Edward Evans. There is no hesitation, no indication of concern. He steps inside. The door closes behind him, and with that, the moment is set. The conversation that follows is brief, casual. Nothing in the tone suggests what is about to unfold. No raised voices. No tension, just ordinary interaction. Then, without warning, the atmosphere changes. Brady moves suddenly, decisively. In his hand, a weapon, an axe. The shift is immediate, from stillness to violence. Evans is struck. The sound is abrupt, jarring. It breaks the quiet completely. There is confusion. A moment where nothing makes sense, where the mind struggles to understand what is happening. Smith watches, frozen, unable to react. The situation is unfolding too quickly, too unexpectedly. Brady continues, each movement controlled, deliberate. There is no hesitation, no pause between actions, only continuation. Hindley does not intervene. She remains present, watching. Her reaction is not one of shock, not one of fear, but something else, something quieter, more contained. The room is no longer ordinary. It has changed completely. What had been familiar is now unrecognisable. Smith remains where he is, his mind attempting to process the scene in front of him, to understand how it has shifted so quickly from conversation to violence. The sounds begin to fade, movement slows, and then silence returns. But it's not the same silence as before. This one carries weight, finality. Brady's demeanour does not change. He remains composed, measured, as though what has happened requires no explanation, no reaction. Hindley remains steady, controlled, part of the moment, not separate from it. Smith is now inside something he cannot step away from, something he did not expect, and something he cannot ignore, because what he has witnessed is not abstract, not distant. It is immediate, real, and in that moment, the truth becomes unavoidable. What had been hidden, what had remained unseen, is now in front of him, and once seen, it cannot be undone. This is where everything changes, because for the first time, there is a witness, and the witness will bring the truth into the light. What David Smith had just witnessed would become the turning point in this case, a moment that would bring hidden crimes into the open and begin the process of uncovering the truth, because until that point, everything had remained concealed, unseen, unconfirmed. There had been disappearances, questions, suspicions, but nothing that could be proven. What Smith had seen changed that completely. But to understand how he came to be in that house on that night, it is necessary to go back, to step away from the moment and look at the path that led to it, because this was not random, not accidental. It was the result of a series of connections, gradual, subtle, and, at first, unremarkable. Smith was 17 years old. He lived in Manchester, a city that at the time was defined by routine, work, family, familiar patterns repeated day after day. His life followed those same patterns. He worked, spent time at home, moved through the same streets, the same environments as those around him. There was nothing to distinguish his life from that of any others his age. No indication that he would become involved in something like this. His connection to the case came through family. He was married to Brady Hindley, the younger sister of Myra Hindley. This connection placed him within the same extended circle, the same social environment as Hindley, and increasingly as Ian Brady. At first, Brady was simply a presence, someone connected through family, someone who appeared ordinary. There was nothing immediate, nothing obvious that suggested anything unusual, nothing that would cause concern. But over time, that presence became more defined, more direct. Brady began to engage with Smith in conversation, in shared time, in ways that extended beyond casual interaction. He introduced him to ideas, books, discussions that moved away from everyday topics towards something else, something more intense. At first, these conversations may have seemed intellectual, detached, exploratory, as though they were examining concepts rather than expressing intent. Discussions about crime, violence, human behaviour, presented in a way that felt analytical, measured. For Smith, this created a sense of inclusion, of being taken seriously, of being part of something. That extended beyond routine conversation, and that made the interaction significant because it built familiarity, comfort, trust. Over time, the tone of those discussions shifted, gradually, almost imperceptibly, from general ideas to more specific ones, more focused, more personal. Brady would observe, listen, assess how Smith responded, what he accepted, what he questioned. It was not rushed, not forced. It developed slowly, over time, and within that process, Myra Hindley remained present, part of the environment, part of the dynamic. Her presence reinforced it, normalised it, made it feel less unusual than it was. There was no single moment where everything became clear, no point at which Smith could fully understand what he was being drawn into. Instead, it developed in stages, through repetition, through familiarity, through gradual exposure, which meant that by the time he was invited to the house on Wardlebrook Avenue, there was no clear reason to refuse, no immediate sense of danger, no expectation of what was about to happen. He arrived that evening as he had before, entering a space that felt known, predictable, controlled, a house that appeared ordinary, a setting that did not raise concern. But what he did not realise was that the situation had already shifted, that decisions had already been made, that events had already been set in motion, and that this time he would not leave with the same understanding he had arrived with, because this time he would see something that could not be explained, something that would remove all uncertainty and replace it with a reality he could not ignore, a reality that would force a decision and ultimately change everything. When the violence stopped, the room didn't return to what it had been before. It couldn't. The stillness that followed carried a different weight, one that lingered, heavy and inescapable, settling over everything in the space. David Smith remained seated where he was. For a moment, it was as though movement itself had become difficult, not physically, but mentally, his mind struggling to reconcile what he had just witnessed with any version of reality he understood. The transition had been too sudden, too complete. One moment there had been conversation, the next, something irreversible. Across the room, Ian Brady's composure remained unchanged. There was no visible panic, no urgency to explain or conceal. His movements, when they came, were controlled and deliberate, as though what had just occurred did not require reaction, only continuation. That absence of visible emotion was in itself unsettling, because it suggested not shock, not loss of control, but intention. Myra Hindley remained present, her role quieter, but no less significant. She did not react in the way someone might be expected to. There was no visible distress, no attempt to distance herself from what had taken place. Instead, she appeared composed, aware of the situation, and fully part of it. Her presence reinforced something unspoken, that this moment was not unexpected. For Smith, the realisation began to take shape slowly, not as a single clear thought, but as a series of fragments, images, sounds, the suddenness of the attack, the lack of hesitation, each piece settling into place until the overall picture became unavoidable. This had not been spontaneous, it had not been an accident, and the people in the room had known what they were doing. That understanding carried with it a second, more immediate awareness. He was now part of it, not by choice, but by presence, by having seen what had happened, by being inside the room when it took place, and that fact changed his position completely. Brady turned his attention toward him. When he spoke, his tone remained calm, measured, almost conversational. There was no urgency in his voice, no raised emotion. The request he made was structured simply, as though it were a practical matter that required assistance, but the meaning behind it was clear. He was being asked to help, to become involved beyond what he had already witnessed. In that moment, the situation narrowed. The options available to Smith felt limited, not because they were not there, but because of where he was and who he was with. The room, the house, the presence of Brady and Hindley, all of it contributed to a sense of containment. For a brief period he said little, long enough to consider what was being asked, long enough to recognise what agreeing would mean, and long enough to understand that whatever decision he made next would define what followed. Refusal carried risk. Acceptance carried consequences, and neither option offered a clear way forward. So instead, he chose something in between. He agreed, but only in part. Carefully he introduced the idea that he needed to leave the house, that he would need to collect something, a tool, something practical that would assist with what Brady had asked. The explanation was plausible, it aligned with the request, and more importantly, it did not challenge the situation directly. Brady accepted it. There was no visible suspicion, no immediate resistance. The response fit within the structure of what had already been proposed, and so it was allowed. That moment created an opening, a narrow one, but enough. Smith stood, moving toward the door without drawing attention to the significance of what he was doing. There was no sudden urgency in his movement, no indication that he intended anything other than what he had said. The door opened, and as he stepped outside, the environment shifted immediately. The air felt colder, sharper, the space around him no longer confined, no longer controlled. For the first time since the events inside the house had begun, there was distance. He did not stop. At first he walked, steady, deliberate, maintaining the appearance of intention, but as he moved further from the house, that pace began to change. The distance mattered, each step creating separation between himself and what he had just left behind. His thoughts did not settle into a clear sequence. They came in fragments, overlapping, repeating, the image of the room, the suddenness of the attack, the calmness that had followed it, and beneath all of that, a growing awareness of what those details meant. There was fear, not just of what had happened, but of what might happen next, because leaving the house did not resolve the situation. It only created space to act, and with that space came the need to decide. He could continue walking, say nothing, attempt to distance himself completely from what he had seen, but that option did not hold, because the events inside the house were not something that could be dismissed or ignored. They remained immediate, present in his mind, impossible to separate from the reality of what had taken place. The alternative was to report it, to go to the police, to describe everything he had seen. That choice carried its own risk. It meant involvement. It meant becoming part of something larger. It meant stepping into a situation that was no longer within his control. But it was the only option that addressed what had happened. The only one that responded to it directly. And gradually, that became clear. The decision was not made in a single moment. It formed as he moved, as the distance increased, as the initial shock began to settle into understanding. By the time he reached the police station, that understanding had become certainty. He entered and reported what he had witnessed. The events inside the house, the presence of Brady, the involvement of Hindley, and the reality of what had taken place. That statement would become the foundation of everything that followed, because for the first time, the investigation had something it had previously lacked. Not suspicion, not theory, but direct testimony. A first-hand account from someone who had been there. And with that, the situation changed completely. The events inside that house were no longer hidden, no longer contained. They'd moved beyond the walls of Wardlebrook Avenue and into the hands of the police. The investigation had begun. When David Smith entered the police station, the urgency of his account was immediately apparent. He was not describing something distant or uncertain. His statement was direct, grounded in specific detail, and focused on events that had taken place only minutes earlier. He described the house, the individuals present, and the sudden escalation of violence he had witnessed. There was a clarity to what he was saying that made it difficult to dismiss. For the officers taking the report, the situation required immediate action. If the account was accurate, and there was no immediate reason to doubt it, then there was a victim inside that house, and those responsible were still present. The priority was no longer investigation in the traditional sense, but intervention. A decision was made quickly to attend the address. Officers were dispatched to Wardlebrook Avenue without delay, carrying with them only the information Smith had provided. At that stage, the scope of what they were dealing with was still unknown. The report suggested a serious assault, possibly fatal, but nothing yet indicated the broader context. When they arrived at the property, the approach was controlled. There was no attempt to force entry immediately. Instead, they knocked, announced their presence, and waited. The response came quickly. Ian Brady answered the door. His demeanour was calm, composed, in a way that did not immediately align with the nature of the report they had received. There was no visible sign of distress or urgency, no indication that anything inside the house required immediate explanation. Officers entered, and within a short time the situation became clear. Inside the living room, they discovered the body of 17-year-old Edward Evans. The condition of the scene confirmed that a serious act of violence had taken place. There was no ambiguity in that assessment. What had been reported was not an exaggeration. It was accurate. Both Brady and Myra Hindley were present inside the house at the time officers entered. Neither attempted to leave. Neither resisted. They were detained at the scene and taken into custody. At this stage, the investigation was still focused on a single event, a homicide witnessed by a third party, with suspects already identified. Initial questioning began soon after their arrival at the station, with investigators working to establish a clear account of what had taken place inside the house. Brady spoke first. His explanation was structured, controlled, and delivered without visible emotion. He described the incident as the result of an argument, suggesting that this situation had escalated unexpectedly. His account framed the violence as spontaneous, something that had developed in the moment, rather than something that had been planned. Hindley's account supported this version. She did not contradict Brady. Instead, her responses aligned closely with his, reinforcing the narrative that had already been presented. To an extent, the consistency between their statements provided a degree of coherence. But coherence did not equal credibility. Even at this early stage, there were elements of the account that raised questions. The level of control described by Smith did not align easily with a spontaneous altercation. The absence of visible panic at the scene suggested something else, something more deliberate. Investigators noted these inconsistencies, but at that point their focus remained on confirming the immediate facts of the case. It was during this process that another detail began to emerge. Earlier that same day, prior to the events at Wardlebrook Avenue, Brady had visited Manchester Central Railway Station. At the time, this action appeared unrelated, a routine movement, not directly connected to the events under investigation. But as questioning continued, and as Brady's movements were examined more closely, this visit took on greater significance. He had left a suitcase in the luggage office. The existence of the suitcase was not immediately known to investigators. It emerged gradually through the process of questioning and cross-referencing Brady's movements. Once identified, it became a priority. Officers were sent to the station. They located the left luggage office and confirmed that a suitcase matching the description provided had been deposited there earlier that day. It was retrieved and transported for examination. Up to that point, the investigation had been centered on a single act of violence. The suitcase would change that. When it was opened, the contents were not immediately understood in full, but it was clear that what had been found did not align with the explanation Brady had provided. Inside were photographs, items that appeared personal but did not correspond to any obvious context. Their significance was not immediately clear, but they raised questions about origin, about purpose, and about why they had been stored in this way. There were also audio recordings, tapes that at first were simply catalogued as part of the evidence, but their presence suggested preparation, intent, the deliberate collection and storage of material. As investigators began to examine these items more closely, the direction of the case began to shift. This was no longer consistent with a single spontaneous incident. The materials indicated something more structured, something repeated, something planned. With that shift in understanding came a change in approach. Brady was questioned again. This time, the focus was broader. Investigators began to challenge the limitations of his initial account, asking questions that extended beyond the events of that evening. They introduced inconsistencies, tested the boundaries of his explanation, and sought to identify where it began to break down. But Brady's responses remained controlled. He did not deviate significantly from his original position. He maintained the narrative of spontaneity, resisting attempts to expand the scope of the discussion. Hindley was also interviewed further. Her responses continued to align with Brady's, reinforcing the same version of events. But as with Brady, the consistency of her account did not resolve the question that had already emerged. Instead, it deepened them. Because the more the evidence was examined, the more difficult it became to reconcile it with what they were saying. Photographs, the recordings, the deliberate act of placing the suitcase in storage. None of it suggested something unplanned. None of it aligned with a single moment of escalation. And as investigators began to consider that, another possibility emerged. That this was not the beginning, but the continuation of something that had already been taking place. At that point, the investigation expanded beyond the house on Wardlebrook Avenue. Investigators began reviewing unsolved cases, missing persons, disappearing children, cases that had remained unsolved, cases that until now had no clear connection. But now, those connections began to form, gradually, carefully, and with increasing certainty, because what had begun as a response to a single witness statement had developed into something much larger, something that extended beyond one victim, beyond one event, and into a series of crimes that had remained hidden for years. As the evidence continued to be examined and the initial assumptions surrounding the case began to shift, investigators found themselves confronting a new possibility, one that extended beyond the events of October the 6th, one that suggested this was not an isolated act of violence, but part of something more structured, more deliberate. The material recovered from the house and the suitcase did not exist in isolation. It formed a pattern, not immediately clear in its entirety, but consistent enough to raise concern. There were indications of preparation, of intent that extended beyond a single moment, of actions that had been considered and repeated. And as that understanding developed, the focus of the investigation began to expand. Attention turned outward, away from the immediate crime scene, toward other cases that had remained unsolved, disappearances that had, until now, been investigated independently, without confirmed connection. One of those cases was that of Pauline Reed. She had been 16 years old when she disappeared in July 1963. She left her home with a clear intention to attend a dance. It was a routine decision, one that did not raise concern at the time, but she never arrived. Searches had been conducted, inquiries made, but without evidence the investigation had gradually lost direction. Her disappearance remained unresolved. Then there was John Kilbride, 12 years old, last seen in November 1963. Witnesses had described him speaking to a man and a woman, a detail that had been noted, but never fully acted upon. The descriptions were not precise enough, the identification never confirmed, and over time, the case had stalled. And then, Keith Bennett, also 12, missing since June 1964. He had been sent on a short journey, a simple errand, a route that should have taken minutes, but he never returned. Searches had been extensive, community involvement significant, but like the others, there had been no resolution. Individually, each case had been treated with seriousness. Each had been investigated thoroughly, but without clear evidence linking them. They had remained separate. Now, that separation was being questioned, not through speculation, but through emerging evidence, through patterns that could no longer be ignored. Investigators began to compare timelines, locations, witness accounts, looking for overlap, looking for consistency, and as the process unfolded, connections began to take shape. Not immediately, not conclusively, but steadily, piece by piece, a pattern involving young victims, approached in familiar environments, removed without clear trace, and not recovered. That final detail became increasingly significant, because it suggested something beyond the initial act. It suggested concealment, planning, a location, and that question of location began to take shape within the investigation. If multiple crimes had been committed, where had they taken place? And more importantly, Where had the evidence been taken? Fragments of information began to surface, references, movements, details that on their own held limited meaning, but when considered together, began to point in a specific direction. A place that had not previously been central to the investigation, a place that existed outside the immediate urban environment, a place that offered something the city did not. Isolation, distance, and the ability to conceal. Saddleworth Moor. Until this point, the moor had not been a focus. There had been no clear evidence directing investigators there, no confirmed connection, but now that began to change, because as the possibility of multiple victims became more likely, so too did the need for a location that could accommodate that reality. Saddleworth Moor offered that possibility. A vast landscape, difficult terrain, ground capable of concealing what had been placed within it. It was not yet confirmed, not yet proven, but it was no longer dismissed. Plans began to form, search strategies considered, resources discussed, because if the connection was correct, the moor would need to be examined, carefully, systematically, with the understanding that what might be found there would confirm the full extent of the case. At this stage, those searches had not yet begun, but the direction was set. The investigation had moved beyond uncertainty, beyond isolated events, into something defined, a series of crimes, linked, structured, and concealed. Miles away from the city, the moor remained unchanged. The same wind moved across the land, the same ground held its shape. There was nothing visible to suggest what lay beneath. To anyone passing through, it was still just landscape, open, quiet, unremarkable. But now, for the first time, it was being considered differently. Not as scenery, but as a location, a place that might hold answers. And soon, those answers would be sought, directly, deliberately, because what had remained hidden was about to be uncovered, and when it was, it would confirm everything. Thank you for listening. That is where we're going to leave things for today. In the next episode, the focus moves away from the house and out onto Saddleworth Moor, and it's there the investigators will begin to uncover the full reality of what happened. Before we close, I just want to take a moment to say thank you for listening, and a quick shout out to a few of you who have been supporting the podcast. James in Leeds, Sophie in Manchester, and Callum down in Bristol. Thank you for the messages and for following along with the series. It really does make a difference. And if you're listening right now and finding the series engaging, make sure you're following or subscribed on whatever platform you're using. That way, you won't miss the next episode when it's released. And if you have a moment, leaving a rating or review helps more people find the show. It's a small thing, but it goes a long way. Episode 3 is where the story reaches its most difficult point, and where the answers that have been building finally begin to surface. So make sure you don't miss it, because what is hidden for so long is about to be found.